This meeting is being recorded.
Thank you, Drew, for the introduction. And welcome everybody for this talk on rapid iterations with server-driven UI. So let's begin with, what would you do if you were in my shoes? So here's my story. I joined my current team at Robinhood that owns critical app features such as like stock detail pages. If you've used the app, the fancy charts that show you, the stock details. And as soon as I joined, I found that all the clients we support, basically iOS, Android, and the web, are super thick. So majority of rendering logic of the app was basically on the client side. Most traditional development, right? So for one of the first project that came my way, the estimation of getting the work done was across all the platforms was super large. So that's going to span across like multiple months, although the change itself was pretty small. Added with that were the difficulties of inconsistencies across the current platform because of the divergent behavior in iOS versus Android. Basic example, let's say a button on my iOS app was padded towards the left. On the Android, when the developer decided, they just put the button on the center or the right. So definitely divergent behavior across this time. So I'm Akanksha Gupta, currently an engineering manager with Robinhood, and I'm going to share like my story here with one of this recent project we did, which is rapid iterations with server-driven UI. Just with the show of e-hands in the chat, how many of you have heard about the concept of server-driven UI? Anyone?
I'm trying to find the reactions in my Zoom.
If not, yeah, that's what we are here for, to learn that. So next slide, please. So yeah, this is just a brief about me. Currently I'm with Robinhood. I've worked with Amazon in their Audible org, and then previous to that was with Microsoft. I did my master's from Columbia, New York. So I'm based in East Coast, pretty close to New York City, but based in Jersey right now. Um, I have judged like several business and technology awards, and that's how I like to stay up to date. And I'm an active mentor at some of these platforms like Plato, Growth Mentor, First Round Fast Track. So, in case you are interested, feel free to hit me up either through these or through LinkedIn. Next slide, please. So this is like the overall agenda that we're going to look at, which is, we talk about the traditional software development, how it looks like, especially keeping in mind, the mobile app development. We'll talk about, what exactly is server-driven UI, how it works, and then we'll go through advantages and challenges. And then I'll share a snippet of what exactly we did at Robinhood, without like breaching their NDA. And yeah, so hopefully, we'll at the end of 15-20 minutes, we all learn at least at a high level what server-driven UI is. Next slide, please. So this is how, so let's first start with talking about a traditional mobile development, right? So in a traditional mobile development, you have the layout and presentation. So that is what the developer basically, implements codes like, hey, how this button is going to look like, what would be the color, the padding, and all that logic about the layout and presentation of the UI is basically packaged into the app. Once that is done, so this is the developer writing the code is packaged into the app as a build. The next step is for the developers to submit that app package into either the Play Store, depending on whether it's Apple or Google. uh, Once that is done, the it's now we are now at the mercy of Apple and Google. Like they will review our app, make sure that we pass all this, our app passes all the sanity checks. um, and this cycle of course takes times and weeks, so like a week or two is taken into this for all these approvals. Once that is done, even the experimentation that is done, I know I was checking for Apple, it's like they go 1%, then 5%, just like dialing up any other experiment. So this seems to be more of like a starting form of development. You might ask why? Because if I need to introduce another change into this, that means I need to again go through this whole cycle in a pretty waterfall model where the developer will make the code change. We then again submit it to the app store, and then it gets released. And in contrary to the backend services that we do, where everything is controlled through us, so the developer can code and we can do the deployment at our own wishes and whims, of course following the internal approval process. Also, another disadvantage that I see with the traditional mobile development is you cannot roll back instantly, because you don't have much of the control. So any sort of faulty release, either you need to, like you've seen, the apps will release another sort of another release that says, hey, fixing this bug, blah blah blah, from this version. um, Another thing that we should look at is, because let's say we are supporting the three clients, as we said, like web, Android, and iOS, there's a lot of duplicate code that we are going to write. An iOS developer will write, the will develop, like implement the whole code to be written for the iOS app. The Android developer is going to do the same, and the web developer. And that's where, since we have three different developers deciding the whole presentation, there can be that divergent behavior that I mentioned in the start. So this definitely calls for a lot of issues, as you can see. And just from the diagram, we have the client where the UI is packaged into the app. It will send a request to the server, and the server will respond back with the data. So it will tell you, okay, what needs to be rendered, but how it needs to be rendered is basically on the client side in the app. Next slide, please. And in terms of the duplicate code, as you can see, just a pictorial representation of what we talked about. You have like screen one, screen two, implemented for web, same for iOS and Android. So biggest question is, like, in this fast-paced world, where technology is like moving really fast, can we wait this long, right? Next slide. So that's where the whole concept of server-driven UI enters. So in a basic layman language, the idea is to present the view as well as the data models from the API instead of just the data models that the traditional mobile development does. So your server will not only tell you what needs to be displayed, which was the data, but how it needs to be displayed. So we are going to send extra meta information from the server itself to the client, and client can be like like a blank rendering slate with very little logic of its own. So what this does is, first of all, we offload a lot of logic to our backend. So our front end can be pretty thin. The other is, it opens a plethora of opportunities, right? Because now we control the build, right? If there's any change that needs to happen at the server end, we can make that change, do the deployment following our company's own deployment cycle, instead of relying on the mobile development releases by Apple and Google. Yeah, next slide, please. So just like trying to imagine what it means is that we have the three surfaces, right? Web, iOS, and Android, and all the screens will be powered by the same consistent logic coming from the server side. Don't worry if it's a little daunting. Like, we will just get into a code snippet just to see what it means. But the overall idea is to remove inconsistencies, make sure that we are not relying heavily on our client logic, and we create like this central logic which becomes like the source of truth, right? Referencing from Lord of Rings, like one code base to sort of rule them all. So one code base to kind of rule all the presentation for the different surfaces. Next slide, please. Awesome. So let's see how it's done. In a basic setup, server, the client will send a request to the server that, hey, this is being requested. The server will respond back with the view, which is what needs to be displayed, and also the data model. It can be any format. The most common that I have seen is the JSON format. But you can always like experiment and have your own formats. Once this metadata is returned to the client will then parse this view and model separately. So it will understand, okay, this is the data which coming for my data model, which is like, okay, display, ABC, Columbia, Devops. And then it will also be able to parse, okay, what's the view, right? Do I need to show it as a button? Do I need to show it as a panel? And then that's how, we decide the rendering piece. Also at client side, you can have things like triggers and actions. So this is basically like, hey, if anytime a button is displayed, is clicked, we want to like do some sort of redirection. So this will be coded at the client side. So your client side will understand that as soon as the server responds like, hey, we expect here a button, and on redirection, it should go to this XYZ link. So that sort of, common sense logic will be part of the client, and it should be able to read that metadata and, do that functioning for us. A big use of this is that if you want to set up any button anywhere in your app, you don't really need a client side change. So what you basically have to do is just go to your server side logic, update your code to say, okay, in the presentation layer here, a button needs to be displayed based on this XYZ logic. And that's it, right? You do the deployment. And you can do the same for even removing a button, right? So such common UI templates, items can be like templatized. Next slide, please. So this is a very basic example of, how a server driven UI code can look like. This doesn't mean that that's how we use it at Robinhood. This is just to, explain the concept. So let's say we are trying to, render two fruits, apple and banana, with some, likability percentage, right? So in the server driven UI on the right, you'll see that the response from the server looks like, hey, the type. So it's going to display it on the home screen, a title bar that says fruits. Within the fruits section, there are, each component has two models to it, right? The data model and the view. So the data model will tell, okay, the label would be apple with some percentage and XYZ description. And the view says that it should be a button of color red with height 20, pixels or whatever, and width of 15. Similarly, looking at the bottom example, it says that we want to display a label with banana. And the view of this is it should look like a header text. So automatically your client will, show apple on a button and banana on a header text with the color yellow and the height and width that is specified here. So your API itself is returning a collection of these UI components, which make up the presentation of the whole screen. Next slide, please. So biggest advantages, right? You're writing this code once and sharing business logic across various platforms. So the biggest component of reusability, because you're not writing, APIs for iOS or Android differently. You're writing this one generic, API, and the clients are basically consuming that. Another thing is, let's say, you want to change something on your UI after the product is shipped, you can do that if you're controlling that from the server side, right? You set up an icon for your particular app and you feel like, oh, this is not something that works, or we need a different pixel, you can obviously change that without going through the whole deployment cycle. um, yes, with such release cycles, you have a faster go to market strategy. You can like deploy faster. And literally, for my team, the deployment went from weeks to days, literally, like, because we control everything. For the product teams, it has been especially useful because they can do, rapid like experimentation, things like A/B testing. Um, there was, we were able to eliminate inconsistencies across the platforms. As I said in the start, for Android, we had a tag which was yellow in color, and for iOS, it was gray. So we were able to like really standardize that across all our surfaces, keeping our clients super thin. Another advantage, which I've not explicitly mentioned here, is in times of like a high severity issue. There were instances where things were more catered to the presentation side of things, or a button was disabled, and we were like able to really fix that super fast in like faster response times, just because we controlled everything on the server side. So it was basically like one source of truth that will be reflected across all clients. Also helps to build trust, with your customer base. Next slide, please. Now, everything looks good, right? Like, hey, this seems to be an awesome thing. Why not every company uses that? So some of the challenges here are that your client has no context on the UI it's rendering, right? So when you are developing such a server driven framework, you want to make sure you have very robust, like logging, monitoring, all those aspects that come with the development, just to make sure that any issue or bug that creeps in, you're able to like triage, what layer do we start with. The other thing that we found was how to build the right backend abstractions, right? So let me put it in simple terms. We're using JSON, right? Now we say, hey, in the view, we want to show this carousel, which should have like a button. Can a button have a label? So how much layers of nesting do you want to allow? Because in the end, you want your API and your system to be responsive, right? You don't want like 30 seconds for your UI to load. So just deciding that based on the traffic and the data you are rendering, what's the right level of nesting. That's another tricky problem that one needs to tackle. Testing can be sometimes challenging. In the usual model, you just get your QA team or the developer to test. This definitely needs like more testing, where you are trying to figure out, hey, it might be mostly on the server side, but what if my client is not parsing the trigger action correctly? So it just opens up like two places where you have to like dig deep. um, and the fourth is definitely the performance, which I covered as part of the backend abstractions, because you want to make sure that these response sizes do not get like super major or bulky. Yeah. So moving on to the next slide. So this is a quick snippet of how we used it at Robinhood. So I'm not sure if you all have used the app, but this is one of the feature around the ETP data, so or ETFs, where we want to display to our customer that if they invested in a particular ETF, what does it comprise of, with like beautiful colors, and giving it like a visual to it with different percentages. So initially, this all used to follow like our client side logic. And we had multiple requests where the product team was like, oh, this green shade doesn't look better. Or maybe people relate to technology more, if it's like dark blue, based on the user research. And every time, such a change would come in, we would have to go through the whole cycle. And that was just taking too long. So we actually converted this whole feature into server driven. And so everything you see, the two screens you see here are all driven through the server driven UI. So basically, hey, show this, particular boxes with what sort of, padding, coloring, what needs to relate to technology, all are being driven through our server. And so it's going to be consistent across all our surfaces. Next slide, please. Yeah, and this is another area where we use this power of server-driven UI, even to like make changes in charts. So, like understanding the concept, it looks like, oh, we can, render it through buttons, through labels, but you can actually use server-driven concept even in the various charts that you see on the app. So what is a chart? A chart is basically, set of lines that are segments, and in the end they're basically XY coordinates, right? So you can make your API like have the logic and your API return all those XYZ coordinates that need to be plotted, and that itself can be parsed by the client to actually generate all these charts that we see. So this was one of the most powerful thing, one of the most trickiest thing that my team did. We had to do like a lot of calculations, like get into a little bit of math as well. But yeah, it definitely one of our common problems that were reported, especially being in a very highly FINRA regulated environment, was the consistencies across the surfaces. Like, oh, I saw this particular, a stock high on my app, and on the web it was showing something different, major regulation issue. And server driven UI helped us like really resolve them all. Next slide, please. Yeah, so just summarizing the key takeaways that we have. So it definitely helps with, it looks amazing, it's a very powerful tool, allows with faster development and iterations, saves time. We all read about the advantages, but the biggest thing is that it's not a silver bullet solution. You have to take the right judgment based on, whether you are like early in your app release, what sort of complexity will your app have, to really decide whether you want to, invest into, having a framework around server driven UI and making your systems, work with this concept. I would highly recommend all to read about an Airbnb blog on server-driven UI. It's pretty neat, and they have been one of the company who has publicized a lot about the server-driven UI architecture. So, really good resource that everybody should read about. Next slide, please. Yeah. Okay. Last slide. Yes. So thank you for attending. And with this, I can take any questions or, anything on server driven UI.
Yeah, thanks for the presentation. And maybe a quick question about how widely this approach might be adopted in the industry. Do you have a feel for, is this in its infancy? Is it taken off? And yeah, any comments you have on that?
Yeah, so I would say it has definitely taken off. Amazon is using it in some version, Google is using it, Airbnb is using it. So all the current, the latest apps that are coming in, which need to be super interactive, and especially for the apps that have a similar feel. So I know like with Airbnb, they have the one app which is to book like the general renting places, but they also released a app for their luxury rentals. So yeah, perfect, that's the one. So definitely, I think it's really picking up. It's not a very new concept, it's been there for years. I think just the adaptation of it is taking long, just because you have to take the right judgment, right? let's say you are in a very early stage, writing an app. You won't start over engineering with server driven UI, right? It gets to a point where it can get really bulky and tricky, and you would not be able to get to the market earlier. So yeah, so I would say it's not in its infancy, it's taken off, and a lot of big companies are using it.
Great, thank you, and thanks for the blog post. Appreciate it.
Yep.
So
Oh.
is it potentially that the developing the schema is one of the most difficult parts of this? Yeah, because I'm just thinking about like all the things that go into that. It's got to be pretty crazy to sort of think through all of those things that you need to send down.
Right. Yeah, you nailed it, Nicholas. So that's exactly the thing that uh, you will mostly decide on your custom level, what the schema would look like. Of course, most of the companies are using JSON, but as I mentioned, the level of nesting you want to do, and based on your app scenario, what all things or items, can be templatized. So that's the one, that's the trickiest. And even when you are developing, like, how do you make sure that your schema is extensible for future improvements, right? We're not going to get it right the first time. So having that concept of like like a versioning system is going to be important.
Awesome, thank you.
Yep.
When you started to make the move over to more server side, did you have to scale up the horsepower over on the server side to make up for that?
Yes, great question. Yes, we had to. And that's where tricky things also started coming into picture, where like for companies like Robinhood, they are like closely tracking their AWS usage, so they use AWS for their infrastructure, and they're like, oh boom, we need so many servers. Especially when we moved charts to server driven, our bills definitely like took like a steep high, because that's where the opportunity comes, where you have to now start improving your system. You did this awesome thing, but you have to now improve the system. So yes, definitely you have to spin more servers, because obviously you are offloading a lot of logic to the server, and that definitely calls for some sort of optimizations and performance management.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, great questions.
I've got one more question. It's kind of two. It's a little bit of a cheat. There's
Yes, go for it.
I
And
got
I might not know all the answers, so I will always get back to you in case I don't know.
I mean it's not really a simple like it's I've seen a number of apps, right, that it's clear that the app is just a glorified browser that it just points at a website. So like
Mhm.
how is there a balance? Like, how do you make these lighter clients feel like they're still apps, where it doesn't feel like it's just a browser on my phone that's just doing like HTTP requests? And then
Right.
the same way, right? Like, if you're trying to make a model that works on mobile, like, how do you get that balance to where when I do use my browser on my desktop, that it doesn't feel like all you did was shim an app onto my browser?
I can name two apps that do just that: the postal service and UPS. They both they look like mainframes underneath with a thin shim on top. So I get exactly what you're saying.
Yeah.
Sorry for the interruption, but yeah, I
No,
know
no,
what you're
no.
talking about.
Yeah. So I think the way I would say is that I think the scenario that Drew you are mentioning is where they are just like they are this app and they are just forwarding it to another app or another system in itself, right? Um, Server driven UI is not exactly that, I would say. So basically, let's just take an example of Airbnb, right? Like Airbnb itself is not forwarding that to another, internal system or another company. It's the company in itself. What they have done is offloaded like their client logic to their own servers. So they are writing the code. So I think if I'm not mistaken, there's a slight difference, right? That everything is controlled by the same company. But yeah, correct me if I'm wrong.
No, you're correct. It's no, you're absolutely right. Like I know, or at least I think I know that the server driven is definitely not just put a browser in the app, the end. Like that, it's
Right.
definitely it's a real app. I
Yeah.
it's just I was just thinking more along the lines of just from a design perspective. And I guess if I were to dig a little deeper, I would probably find the answer, right? Is
Mm-hmm.
like how does the same server response going to a mobile app feel like a mobile app on the mobile app? And then how does that, what I think is the same server response going to a web browser, how does that
Mm-hmm.
feel, wind up feeling like a legit real web browser feel
Real. Yeah.
experience?
Yeah. And I think that's my understanding is definitely that that's where, it's not like you have to fire all your client developers, right? So there is still
Right.
magic
Yeah.
happening at the client side, where they are definitely parsing, all this server logic using some, middle layers, of course. Yeah,
No,
but
that
I
makes
think
sense.
I feel
I'll
like
bet
you're
it's also like related to Nick's question. Like I'll bet a properly designed schema probably
yes.
goes a long way there.
I feel like her example of the graph shows that because you're telling them just the points, you're not just sending them the whole picture, right? I think that's an example of the difference between doing a browser and doing the data driven or
Yeah,
yeah.
fair.
Yes. And that's where the client also needs to decide, because the mobile screen is super small, the web is like pretty, big. So the client will decide all that rendering based on the space that they have. But the server response is just the same, right? It's trying to give you those X points. Maybe what mobile can do is just pick 20, because that's what it can fit in, while the desktop one can pick the top 30 and render them.
Sure. Okay. No, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. That was a hard, kind of unfair question. Sorry.
No, that's, every question is fair. Yeah, any other questions, thoughts? Yeah, but I have been fascinated with the amount of publicity that Airbnb has done. I think their platform is called Ghost Platform, and they have done like bunch of, you'll find like YouTube talks, blogs. Um, I think that's where I got most of my concept to learn from.
And that's really cool. Oh, it was completely brand new to me. I think it's neat.
Yeah. Um,
Okay.
awesome. Any more questions?
Yeah, and let's see. I'm looking. Nothing in the chat. No, I think we've got that.
Awesome.
Yeah, this is awesome. Thanks, Akanksha. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you for, inviting me.